Hello, welcome to Layer 7 standalone gateway setup. In this particular video clip, what we are going to do is we'll go through the configuration setup of the network. We'll look at then we'll configure the database, and then we are going to connect to Layer 7 Policy Manager. So before we drive this, it's important that you do install VMware on your computer. At the same time, if you have need to install SSH client and HCP client also install on it together with SOAP UI. I will pass it on to Sanjay, who will drive the process of installation for Gateway. Sanjay.
Hello, this is Sanjay from Layer7 Technologies. So anyway, just to add to Kareem's what he said right now, so obviously the prerequisite is that we have to have a VMware VM player for Windows machine, and if you're doing this on Mac, you need to have a VMware Fusion. So I'm going to use Fusion for now, but I'm hoping that you guys will be Windows users and please use VM player. VM player is freely downloadable from vmware.com, and then we also need an SSH client. So for Windows world, putty is a or putty or putty, whatever you call it, is a good SSH client. We also need a SCP client. So either you could use SCP or you could use WinSCP.
Okay.
So what happens with that is that you do a SFTP, so you can securely transfer the file over to the gateway.
Okay.
And we also need the SOAP UI. All right, so I'm going to begin, start importing one of the VMs. The way I do it in Mac is different, but it's almost similar. So I import from here. You would be probably double clicking your OVA file. OVA stands for Open Virtual Archive probably. So I'm going to go ahead and import, and typically this is how your OVA file would be named as SSG underscore 64-bit, so on, what version you're running. So right now it's pre-selected. I'm going to continue, and this will start the import process. Make sure it's not a requirement, but it makes it much more easier to handle. The virtual image name SSG is a good name, a short name. There's no need to add version because later on you might be upgrading your version that way. Alright, so I'm going to save and start importing it. Takes a while depending on your machine speed.
So your OVA file is basically located in the package that Layer 7 have provided to us, and OVA is one of the files that you could connect it and bring that down.
Yes. And while this is importing, also ensure that if you have the OVA that's for 64-bit, you need to have your 64-bit enabled in your Windows. Basically, your virtualization has to be enabled for 64-bit in Windows.
Yeah, that's important.
And that can be done through the BIOS settings.
Right.
Alright, so looks like it has imported correctly. So what we'll do before we start the virtual machine, it's very important to change the settings. If you see here, by default our OVA comes as 2 gig of RAM and 2 CPUs, but for definite, and also our network is automatically set as bridged. We got to change this. The reason we need to change this is because your machine might not have a lot of RAM, and if you run this, it'll hog up all the RAM and the CPUs. So first thing is you go ahead and select one processor. You make sure your memory is 1 GB, and you also pick the NAT as your network adapter. So I would select the first option here. So here, if you see, this is NAT, and in your VM player, please ensure that you have NAT as your initial network adapter. Alright, the setting has been done. So I hit the play button, and this will start my virtual machine.
So NAT is critical for both, even the setup for production will use the same.
Yes, initial setup
Okay.
will be NAT.
And can you tell us more a little bit why NAT?
NAT is kind of like a virtual private network.
Okay.
So here I'm using NAT. That means what happens is basically I'm establishing a virtual private network within my. So my machine is the host, and this is the guest operating system running here.
Okay.
So my host will have a dedicated connection, and it's protected from outside world. All right. So as you see, once your VM starts up, you'll be presented with this welcome screen, and that would say Layer 7 Gateway on the top, along with the version number and also the kernel number. And you need to log in. So your default user ID to log in to your VM is ssgconfig. ssgconfig, and we hit enter. And this would take us to the new screen. It's not a new option. This will present us a new option, and where we'll enter the password. The default password is 7-layer. 7-layer. The moment you present the default password, it will ask you to change the password. But here, before you change the password, it also will ask you to give your current password, that is 7-layer. And now you select a more secure password. We have a password protection policy. So I'm going to show you how the password would look like. It would be L7 secure $0 @ So this is the initial password which meets all our password requirement.
Right.
But feel free to pick any secure password you want to, but this is a typical password which will work. So when you successfully enter the password, you'll be presented with the welcome menu, the main menu, and you can see there are various options here. So initially when we are configuring, so right now we're doing the first step, that is configuring the gateway's network settings. So in order to do that, we got to select option number 1. So it'll take us to a sub menu, and on the sub menu we select option number 1, which says configure network and system time settings. And this presents us with basically a command line wizard to set up networking. And here, just to note, a couple of things to note is anything that is selected that is within the square brackets. So for example, you see the make a selection square bracket begin number 1 square bracket end. This means that it's a default option has been pre-selected for you.
Okay.
So either I can write 1 here, or I can leave it as blank and hit enter. It will be 1.
Same thing.
Yeah. Would like to configure IPv4 networking? Obviously yes. So I'm going to hit enter. Yes is pre-selected. And now you'll be presented with an option that tells you that whether you want your boot protocol for this network interface as static or DHCP. Initially we'll make it as static, and that's how we're configuring the gateway. So by default 2 is selected. We don't want DHCP, we want static right now. The moment you select option number 1, VMware maintains a private pseudo DHCP server which maintains the count of all the IP addresses. So my last IP address was probably 134, so that's why it's presented me with 135. So 192.168. In your machine it will be something else. .1. Typically you will start with 128.
So it's important that they make a note of this IP address because
Yes.
they'll be using that later.
Agreed. Yes. So it's also important to take a note of this IP address. So for now, I'm gonna go ahead and copy, make a note of it in my notepad. That's 192.168.199.135. I come back to my gateway. I hit enter, and second option is obviously enter the default IPv4 gateway for interface. It's optional. We don't need to enter this information right now, and we're perfectly okay. So let's hit enter. Second option is for your, the third option is for your net mask. So we got to enter a valid net mask for this interface. So I'm gonna enter 255.255.255.0. Now it tells me, do you want to configure IPv6? I would say no, because we don't support IPv6 yet. Would you like to configure another interface? If you'd had multiple interface, you'd be allowed to select that, but for now, no is good. Would you like to configure default gateway? No, we don't need a default gateway right now. No is good. Would you like to configure a default v6 gateway? No, no is good. This step is important. It'll ask you to enter a fully qualified host name for this particular gateway. So it's a good practice to give the same name as your virtual image name. So if you remember, we gave it SSG. So here we'll do ssg.l7tech.com. So this becomes your host name, fully qualified host name for this gateway. I hit enter again. It'll ask me to configure the name servers. For now, I don't want to do that. It's a standalone. So hit no. Now it'll ask you to set the time zone. It's very important to set the time zone, otherwise your gateway will not function correctly. So yes is pre-selected, hit enter. Probably you're in Canada, and so you would hit option number 9. If you're in the US, you would hit option number 2, or wherever you are in the world, you'll hit according to that option. Number 9 will take me to a new screen. It'll ask me what time zone I want to select. So for our purpose, we'll make it 7 here. So my time zone has been set. Now it will ask me how to set up an NTP server. So what NTP server means is that it's a way of synchronizing your the gateway's time with the external time server.
Sure. Okay.
But right now we are a NAT network. Obviously we cannot hit the outside world,
That's
so
right.
we'll select no for now. After you do that, you'll be presented with a summary screen, making sure that everything you entered is perfectly okay. So please review this screen. Make sure everything is as it was intended to. And if you want, for some reason, there was a problem and you want to cancel this, hit Control-C. It'll take you out, and you have to redo everything again.
But it will save those settings for you when you're going as a default.
As
correct?
a default. So whatever you entered last time, those things will be saved. So wherever you want to change, yes.
Right.
Okay. So right now I'm going to hit enter. Everything looks good. And it tells you to what files were created for these configurations to take effect. I hit enter again. So my configurations are saved, and when I reboot, those configurations will take effect. So I exit out of this menu, and before I reboot, I normally set up the host file. It's a good practice to set up the host file before you reboot.
Okay.
So in order to do that, we need to go to the root. Root is the command. It's like a shell for the Linux. So we hit option number 3, takes us to the command line menu, root. The initial password for root is 7-layer, and we have to follow the same step at what we did for SSG. We got to change it later on. So 7-layer is my default password. Just to type it, what exactly I was talking about was 7-layer. Now again, it wants you to change the password. So before you change, you have to provide the current password, that was 7-layer. Pick a new password. So I'm going to pick L7 secure, this one. So before I edit the host file, I would also like to change my password back to 7-layer. It makes it easy for me to log in, log out. It's my
Right.
standalone development machine. So let's change the password with the password command PASSWD. Remember this, PASSWD. When you type in PASSWD, enter. This is for changing the password of the root, the current user. And now specify the password. I'm picking 7-layer right now. 7-layer again. Even though it complains, it's perfectly okay. Don't worry about it.
Because the system already thinks it's not strong password, so by default
Yes.
it warns you.
The password is like a force, so it'll change password to anything you want. Now we also need to change the password for SSG config. Remember, back to 7-layer. So this is how we change the password for SSG config. You issue the command password, and then you give the user ID for that. So I'm gonna change it back to 7-layer. 7-layer again. Perfect, my password has been changed back to 7-layer, all my passwords. Now let's go ahead and edit the host file. So remember, I had asked to note down your IP address and the host file and the fully qualified host name. So the fully qualified host name that I gave was ssg.l7tech.com. So in order to edit your host file, you can use any tool, but I prefer VI. VI is a good tool to edit. Host file is in this location, etc hosts. Remember to give S in there, like hosts. It's not just host, it's hosts.
Okay.
That is the file. When I hit enter, my VI will open up and I'll be ready to edit. So if you're new to VI, I would recommend that you scroll down with your arrow key and type in Shift A. Shift A means append. So it's going to go to the end of the line and start appending it. Look how my cursor went to the end of the line. I hit enter. And also note that in the bottom you see insert. So insert means I'm in the insert mode right now. So I give the IP address 192.168. Sorry, I made a wrong.
69.
No, it should be 168. I probably saw typo. I had.
Yeah, it's 168.
Yeah, it's a typo I had. It should be 168. 168.199.135. Next is I give the fully qualified host name ssg.l7tech.com. It's a good idea to give the alias for this host file. ssg is my alias. Now I have put the entry for what is required in the host file. And now I need to get out of the insert mode so that I can save it. So the way you get out of the insert mode is by pressing escape. Escape. Look, the insert mode vanished, and I type colon, and W means write, Q means quit. So write and quit. Just if you want to verify what your host file entry was, you can do a cat etc hosts. This tells you that this is your host file. It looks perfectly okay. So I've configured my network, I changed my host file. Now I need to reboot the gateway. For that I need to exit out of my command line. I go to the main menu and see here is a reboot, the second last option. reboot the SSG appliance. So you could enter R and this will reboot your appliance. It'll ask you, it'll confirm yes or no. So you say yes and we will reboot the gateway.
Okay, so we have completed the configuration of the network.
Network configuration is correct. And next step would be to configure the database.
Okay.
Alright, so pretty quick. We re-enter into gateway with the user ID SSG config. SSG config. We change the password to 7-layer. So 7-layer is a good password now. This takes us to the home screen or the main menu. On the main menu, now we need to configure the database.
Right.
So we are in the step 2 and configuring the database. So to do that, on the main menu, select option number 2 that says display layer 7 gateway and configuration menu. And this takes you to the configuration menu where you would select option number 2. The option number 2 is to create a new layer 7 gateway database.
So the layer 7 database is MySQL?
MySQL. So this is shipped with, okay, this step lets you create a connection with the database. The connection is not configured, this will be better.
Stop.
Alright, so it took us some while. Alright, so we have a database connection. By what happened, this script basically goes and figures out if your database was configured or not. It wasn't configured, so it says it will let me configure the database. So by default, yes is selected. I hit enter. The second option is where you want the database to be hosted. Database will be hosted in the local host. MySQL is a normal standard for MySQL to be running on port 3306, so we leave it as standard. Now we can select a database name for the gateway. The default is SSG, so I would request you to just leave it as default for now. Now we're creating a user in the MySQL that will have access to the SSG database. So this is what the gateway user means. Okay. So when you are trying to create a user, obviously you have to enter the password for that user. I give it 7-layer. I confirm the database password, again 7-layer. Administrative database username. So MySQL, when we ship it pre-configured with root as your root user and 7-layer as a default password for the root user to the MySQL. Do not confuse this root with the Linux root.
Okay.
This root is very specific to MySQL. Administrative database password, so we have to give 7-layer here. Now it will ask you whether you want to do a database failover connection. For standalone, no. So no is good, just hit enter. The next is it wants you to create a username for the policy manager to connect to the gateway. So you're creating an admin user ID password for the gateway who will be able to connect remotely.
Okay.
So admin is a good username here. We give admin. We also pick a password for him. The password, I'm just picking a 7-layer to make it much more easier for us. Confirm 7-layer again. Cluster host is this particular cluster host gets picked up default from your host file. So since it's a standalone, don't have to worry about it. Leave it as default, ssg.l7tech.com. You have to enter a cluster passphrase just in case in future you want to add more node to it. You need this password to add more node to it. 7 layer again. Enable, yes, obviously. Now you can review all the database settings, make sure everything looks good, and once you think everything is okay, definitely hit enter. If for some reason you think you entered something wrong, you can hit Control-C to get out of this, and you can reconfigure it. Your old configuration will be saved in the memory, so you'll be given the old configurations. Feel free to change it.
Okay.
Alright, so looks like my gateway was configured. I just have to hit enter to proceed. Now, database has been created. The gateway will try to restart itself. The way you can check the status is by selecting option number 7 on the secondary menu. Just to make it easier for you, I'm going to go out to the main menu so that you know what exactly I'm doing. Go to main menu, select option number 2, and on the secondary menu select option number 7.
Right.
The 7 gives you the manage layer 7 database status, and that status should be saying running. This takes a while and it says starting right now, so I need to wait for it to run, just to say running. But obviously this is not an auto update. We have to keep on going to this menu. So I hit enter to continue, exit out, hit X to exit out, and again select option number 7 so that I want to see it as running. Alright, great. So when the gateway is running, everything looks good. So this was the step 2. So we configured the gateway and we are all looking good.
So we configure the gateway and we configure the database.
Database, yes. Network settings and database. Now let me stop this recording. So in the second part, we can show you how to connect to the gateway using Policy Manager.